It's spooky season and my desk has been invaded by these 100% anatomically correct skeletons and... No, stop. Stop, what are you doing? Don't look over there. It's definitely still October. It's not November at all. And I've just been thinking I want to do something with this spider skeleton. I don't particularly need a Mini of Lolth, Demon Queen of Spiders, and Matriarch of the Drow, but I think it'd be fun to have one anyway. To start with, I'm going to need to address the cavernous hole of an underbelly that this skeleton has. And I'm just going to be doing that by grabbing some paper clips, which I'm going to bend and cut into a scaffolding, and then gluing them down using a mixture of super glue and baking soda. If you're unaware, baking soda acts as a catalyst, making the glue dry almost instantly. It also adds extra surface area to the joint and dries super hard, almost like a cement or a concrete. Moving on to selecting a torso, I've got a small container of random figures from Dollar Tree. Had a few different options, but decided to go with the random gymnast Barbie. I took a small hobby saw and cut the figure in half just above the hips. You ever wonder if you might be the villain in an unmade Toy Story movie? Yeah, me neither. After I had the torso separated, I drilled a hole, then glued in a wire, pinning the torso to the head of the spider skull. I ended up deciding that I wanted the torso to be a little bit taller, so I left a gap when gluing the parts together. After having it glued together, I decided I didn't like the pose and decided to adjust it. I just cut off the left arm and repositioned it to her side. I removed both the right arm and hand so I could reposition them like she was holding an object. I went through my boxes of random crap to find an orb for which she could ponder. I ended up settling on this faceted bead and glued it into her hand. I also decided I wanted to replace the pedipalps with something a little bit more menacing, so I removed the legs off this random alien toy and glued them on instead. I've got some Tamiya plastic putty, which I'm going to try and use to fill in some of the gaps. I've never used it before, and this seemed as good a time to try it as any. If you don't want to use the putty, you could use super glue and baking soda instead. I probably should have been wearing gloves for this. The putty has a strong chemical smell and they recommend using lacquer thinner with it. After the putty is set, we get to go to the exciting world of sanding. Woo, sanding. Hooray, sanding. And more sanding. And more sanding, yes! Ah, you can never have too much sanding. Are we really still sanding? Now that the sanding is over, we can move on to some boring rhinestone eyes. They're kind of cool, I guess, but they're not sanding. Before moving on to the next step, I decided that I wanted to add a little more scaffolding on the bottom. Just wanted to make sure that I had enough structure to build on top of. And now it's finally time to deal with the fact that Lolth is the queen of spiders and not the queen of skeleton spiders, which can mean only one thing. It's time for paper mache. At this point in the project, I've decided to be experimenting with new materials. I've got basically no experience with paper mache, and I've never seen anyone else use it like this before. It ended up working pretty well. The only major downsides were the mess and dry times. It took nearly 20 hours for each application to fully dry. After the top half finished drying, I did some cleanup. The paper mache cuts pretty easily, and I was able to do most of it with just a scalpel and some side cutters. Then I just repeated the process on the other side. I've got the model propped up on a couple of containers using some poster tack. You can also finally see the scaffolding being put to some use. After drying, I once again did some cleanup, this time making sure to remove any excess glue on the non-paper mache areas to prevent paint chipping later on. The paper towel I used for my paper mache had a pattern on it, which I wasn't thrilled with. I decided to try and cover it up using some spackle, another material that I've never really worked with. I just did a thin coat over everything using wet fingers to smooth it over. This process wouldn't have been necessary if I'd used something like butcher paper that doesn't have a texture instead of paper towels, or if I'd used something with a pattern that looked better. Once that was finished, we got to do even more sanding. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. It's time I gave Lolth some clothing, which of course means getting out the green stuff. Don't forget to remove the section where the two ribbons touch. After thoroughly mixing the putty and letting it set for a bit to firm up, I can start sculpting. I'm not really a sculptor, so I'm mostly just making things up as I go along. I started by rolling out and cutting down a thin strip to make a tube top for her. After I got that stuck down and molded into shape, I repeated the process for the rest of the dress. I used a combination of metal tools and silicone shapers to blend the putty together. I'm not focusing too much on detail right now, I'm just trying to get the general shape. You can't see it, but I do have a small dish of olive oil that I'm using to keep my tools from sticking. After letting it cure and doing some light sanding, I mixed up a second batch of green stuff. I did record me doing the sanding, but I'm keeping it for my own personal use. As you can see, I'm rolling out thin wormies, which I'm using to build up the folds in the fabric of the dress. I just add a little worm wherever I think there should be a fold and then blend it into the rest of the dress. Building up where the green stuff already created folds while I was sculpting the initial dress. After that's finished curing, we can move on to painting. There's just this little trick that I saw online that I think I'd like to try, and not exactly what I was going for, but it seems to have worked. I didn't have a plan going into painting, I just loaded up my airbrush with dark blues and purples and went to town on it. I mostly just use my airbrush for priming and zenithal highlights, and I wanted to get some practice doing actual painting. I did try to focus my darks to the underside and create highlights on the raised portions. I was mostly just throwing paint at the model though, practicing my aim and blends. I just used a regular brush for the human portions. I started with a dark red for the dress, a purplish gray for the skin, and a light gray for the hair. After the base coats, I just applied some washes and highlights. I'd also decided that I'd like to try adding a glow effect to the orb. I don't really know how to do source lighting very well, but decided we'll wing it and see what happens. I started by adding a light base of white to the orb and anywhere I felt the light would be shining. I also added some light spots for the eyes. I then went back over those areas lightly with teal. Moving back to the brush, I added a dot of white to the center of the eyes and each of the faces of the orb. I also added a few edge highlights. I added glazes to soften the edges of the white dots. Final thoughts. It probably would have been better to go into this project with a planned out paint scheme instead of just winging it as I went. I'm also still not great at doing object source lighting and would certainly benefit from more practice with that. The paper mache worked out incredibly well. The biggest downside with it just being how long everything takes to dry. But other than that, it's a really useful material and I think could be a good technique on future projects. The only issue I had with the paper mache was using paper towels that had texture on them, and if I instead switched to using something like tissue paper or butcher paper that doesn't, it would probably work much better. I've been having some issues with the spackle layer, which has been chipping off, which you should be able to see in some of the close-up shots. It's a little strange since I don't think I've ever seen anybody else having this specific issue. I believe it's mostly just a use case problem because the spider and underlying paper mache is a little bit flexible, which I believe is causing the spackle to crack and flake off. Overall, I'm quite happy with the project. It's not amazing, but it is okay and has earned itself a place on the shelf of okay miniatures. Welcome to the part of the video where I do the call to action while you're hopefully looking at some pretty images. If you've been on YouTube for more than 4 seconds, you already know what to do. Click that like button, spank the subscribe, sign the guest page, and post the video to your web zone.